Hi, my name is Professor Shalay Washington, and today's lecture we will be covering the Reconstruction Amendments. So before we get into the Reconstruction Amendments, we will dive into the time frame before that, which is the Civil War. So the Civil War is a very important and historical war that changed America at the end of its course, during its course, and after. The post-Civil War period, it came to be known as the Reconstruction era. So depending on the historian that you're speaking to, dates of the beginning and the end of the Reconstruction, they could differ, but most people usually go within the years of 1865 to 1877. So the Reconstruction Amendments, they're very important because they were added and modified to the U.S. Constitution from in between the years of 1865 to 1870. So these were the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. So all of these amendments were basically meant to protect African Americans legally and civilly, because of course after the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was illegal. So this means that slaves went from being property to actual people. So also along with the Reconstruction Acts that were passed on the federal level, many of the southern states, they also passed laws known as black codes or freedmen's laws. So these laws, they pretty much limited blacks with where they could work, where they could go, where they were allowed to be, their curfew, their travel passes, and other simple freedoms of life. So, even though legally slavery was over, it was almost as if they were still enslaved in a sense. So the 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery or involuntary servitude unless it was unless it was for a punishment for a crime. So this amendment, it crippled the African American community in both a positive and a negative way, because for one, this law, it allowed black people to become free, but it also created the criminal justice system that brought on systematic racism with laws in the disproportionate amount of numbers that African American men and women being imprisoned more than others shows. So the 13th Amendment, it was used more of as an enforcement tool to pretty much scare blacks from going back into slavery days, because if a crime was committed, then they would be sent back into servitude. Another interesting thing about that was that a lot of former plantations, they actually became the new penitentiaries. Here in my region, South Louisiana, Angola. Angola was the biggest plantation in the southeast region. And then after slavery, Angola became the biggest penitentiary in the southeast region, and it still is to this day. And they are, of course, picking items that people would pick on a plantation. So even though the 13th Amendment, it gave freedom to blacks, it also hung some sort of leverage over their heads. Following the 13th Amendment, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And this was basically set out to give blacks equal rights, which granted freedom for all enslaved people. Of course, we know President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And after he was assassinated, President Johnson, he became president. and he was not a fan of the bill, and he was not a fan of black people having any type of rights or equality. And his opinion and sentiments was probably one that a lot of white men shared about African Americans at that time frame, because remind you, slavery had just ended. But also his ideas and his beliefs is also what got him impeached. Actually, he got impeached the same year that the 14th Amendment was amended, and that was in 1868. And so the 14th Amendment, it granted equal protection to all citizens, no matter their color, background, or former status. So the 14th Amendment, it had to be passed because it was hard to pretty much give blacks their rights on a state-by-state basis. So Congress, they felt the need that to enact a law to afford blacks this freedom, especially in the southern states. So the 14th Amendment, it pretty much served as the primary legal battleground for a lot of major civil rights issues and cases, because it legally gave equal rights and opportunity to blacks by law on paper. So even though this law went into effect 150 years ago, we still live in a world where, we see African Americans or other minorities not being treated equally, even though this is a right of theirs. So systematic racism that came from, these amendments, it still affects African Americans in many different categories today. Whether it's credit, job status, education, housing, health, or life in general. So the 15th Amendment, it came in 1870, and it extended the right to vote to African American men. But 140 years later, that is still a topic that can be improved, because, of course, this past year, the election year of 2020 was very tumultuous, historic, and it showed a lot of problems that stemmed from this time frame: disenfranchisement, voting polls, the laws and things that are enacted with it. So March 30th, 1870, it was the day that the 15th Amendment became official in the United States. So the 15th Amendment, it extended the right to vote to all men, regardless of their color, their race, or their former slave status. So Hiram Rhodes Rebel, he was a Republican from Natchez, Mississippi, and he became the first African American to sit in Congress. And so once this law became official, many abolitionist societies and organizations, they pretty much dismantled and they fell apart, because they thought that their fight for equal rights and equal voting rights for black people was over. But as we know, it's 2021 and that fight is far from over. Voting in general. So the 15th Amendment, it granted black men the right to vote, but there was a lot of skepticism that came with that, of course. A lot of women suffragists, they wanted women to be able to have the right to vote, even if it meant that black men could not. Susan B. Anthony, she was against the 15th Amendment because she wanted the right to the vote to go to white women. Of course, that amendment came during the Progressive Era with the 19th Amendment. But as I said earlier, disenfranchisement and voting poll locations, those are just two of the few problems that need to be fixed that stem from the 15th Amendment, which was enacted in 1870. So there are many different instances showing how these amendments have failed to do what they proposed to do. One of the earlier cases after the Reconstruction Amendments was the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, which actually took place in New Orleans. And the thing about that case was that it pretty much solidified separate but equal concepts. And that is something that African Americans had to continue on with, because after Reconstruction era, you get into the time frame of the Jim Crow era. After the Jim Crow era, you get into the time frame of the Civil Rights Movement. So it's a constant movement, or a continuous movement for the fight for African American civil liberties and rights and freedoms. One thing that stemmed from the Reconstruction era, and the amendments that came about in the freedom and rights that it gave to blacks, it brought about the Ku Klux Klan. So the KKK, it was pretty much a major form of resistance to Reconstruction after their first effort to resist emancipation. So in a lot of southern states, a lot of southern cities, the Ku Klux Klan, they had more control than the actual police department. Or in a lot of instances, the police department kind of went hand in hand with the local KKK. So this control was not new for white people or for black people at that time frame. It was just a different type of way, or a different system, because black people went from being enslaved people to free people, and that brought about a new fear amongst many white Southerners. And so in reaction to their fear, fear brings about violence, or reactions of fear, which brings, rage, violence, and things of that nature. And this concept of the Reconstruction era, it is solidified its place in history for a long time, because you have the Dunning School thought, and it was started by William Archibald Dunning. And this is where the Dunning School thought, they usually sided with the white Southerners who interpreted the Reconstruction era as a way for the federal government to abuse their power and to cast the entire Republican Party as evil and corrupt. So his collection of essays, it pretty much painted a picture of corrupt carpetbagger and African American rule amongst white people, which instilled more fear and continued on that fear, until you have historians like Eric Foner, who came about and he changed the law, and not the law, but the outlook and the view on the Reconstruction era, because he breaks it down, institutional, economical, and racial backgrounds of that era, because the historiography, of course, has changed throughout that time frame. And Foner, his research and his evidence, it also helped to bring this actual truth to the world of history. So a lot of things that we discussed in today's Reconstruction Amendment lecture, we will continue to talk about it throughout this course and throughout our different modules. Thank you all for listening, and if you guys have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me via email. I have no problem with responding to any type of questions. Have a great day.